Hi everybody, it is Rabbi David Fohrman here, and Pesach is on its way. The Seder looms. You want to say something at the Seder, but at least at the Sedarim that I've personally been at, there's a problem, because the temptation is to focus on a lot of the little stuff. And at the beginning of the Haggadah, there is a lot of little stuff. There's a lot of what we might call prologue, stories about Rabbi Akiva and Bnei Brak, Ben Azai with those streaks in his beard, looking as if you were 70 years old. And it's easy to pick apart the minutiae associated with those stories. But by the time you're done with that, it's 11 at night, everybody's hungry, and frankly, nobody at the table's really gotten a chance to talk about any of the big stuff, the story of the Exodus, or even the larger themes that emerge from that story. In this video series, I'm going to try to focus with you on some of that big stuff. I want to help us develop a perspective on the Exodus saga as a whole and try to glimpse some new meaning in it, meaning that will enrich not only our understanding of the Exodus story, but also our understanding of our own destiny, because we're a nation that came into being through that story. I want to begin by sharing something which has always gnawed at me whenever I found myself rereading the biblical text that talks about the climax of the Exodus. I'm talking about the confrontation of Egypt and Israel at the Sea of Reeds. As Pharaoh's armies are chasing after the departing Hebrews, God tells Moses, I'm going to split the sea, the Israelites are going to walk through on dry land, the Egyptians are going to chase them. And then the language of the text is God tells Moses that when that happens, I'm going to be honored through Pharaoh, through his army, through his chariot, through his horsemen. You'll forgive me if this sounds a bit forward, but doesn't that kind of sound like a mean thing to say? Here God is, he's about to destroy many hundreds of people, and he's speaking of this honor that's going to come to him. He's getting honor through their deaths? It just seems unbecoming of the Almighty to speak that way. Look, yeah, it's true the enemies of the Israelites are the Egyptians, and yeah, it is better that they be destroyed than be allowed to recapture and re-enslave the Israelites. But look, it's one thing to defend Israel by killing her enemies. It's another thing to take glory and honor from all of that killing. Why would you put it that way if you're God? Okay, so for a long time I kept quiet about this. It just felt like an uncomfortable thing to bring this up. But the truth is, it's not just my own personal sensitivities that seem to run afoul of this verse. Interestingly enough, the sages of the Talmud actually once suggested that the Almighty himself shares these very same sensitivities. Here's actually what they say. The Holy One, blessed be He, does not rejoice in the downfall of evildoers. That's the value that you and I were talking about, and listen to their proof text. It comes from this very story of the sea. When the Egyptians were dying in the Sea of Reeds, as the waves came crashing down, Ba'osasha, at that moment, Bikshu Malachei Asharis Lomer Shira Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The heavenly angels wanted to sing in rapture before the Holy One, blessed be He. But Amalena HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said to them, Masa Yodai Tovim B'yam. My creatures, they're drowning in the sea. Va'atem Amrim Shira Lefanai. And you're going to pick this time to rejoice in front of me. It turns out that the sages ascribe the exact same intuition to the Almighty himself that we were talking about. You don't rejoice in the downfall of your enemies, particularly if you're God. God's the creator, and even his enemies are creatures that he's created. There's something bitter in the taste of victory against them. And what's really weird is that the same story that we felt seemed to offend our sensitivities, the story of the splitting of the sea, is where the sages get their proof text from, that God would never rejoice in the downfall of the wicked. So what's going on here? How could they have looked at that same story, which has this verse that talks about God taking glory and honor from the destruction of Egypt? How could they have looked at that story and say, no, God would never rejoice in the downfall of the wicked? They were surely aware of the verse. How could they ignore it? So I want to suggest to you that it's actually we who are misinterpreting the verse, not the sages. In other words, when the Almighty spoke of taking honor from all the king's horses and all the king's men, he wasn't actually talking about taking glory from the deaths of the Egyptians whatsoever. If you look carefully at the verse, it never says God's taking honor from their deaths. I'm taking honor from Pharaoh and from his horsemen and from his archers. The verse doesn't actually mean he's taking honor from their deaths. What it means is actually something else entirely. The glory that would come, as the text phrases it, from the chariots and archers of Egypt is actually the tip of a very large iceberg. An iceberg that shows us a whole new face of the entire Exodus story. As it turns out, these chariots and archers of Egypt that supposedly are going to be honoring God, it's not the first time we encounter them in the Torah. They show up one other time in the 5 books of Moses, earlier, at the very end of the book of Genesis, in a story that involves, of all things, a funeral procession for the patriarch Jacob. But the really remarkable thing is that it's not just this particular element of the Exodus, the chariots and the archers, that happened to appear earlier in the Genesis burial story. It's actually a whole bunch of elements from the Exodus story that seem to get borrowed by that very same burial story of Jacob. I want to kind of go through these similarities between the stories and then see what it is that you and I make of them. Let me give you an example. Here's a verse from the story of the burial of Jacob. It's an ordinary verse that wouldn't really cause even a raised eyebrow. As a matter of fact, it appears to tell us something so trivial that one wonders why it even needed to be said at all. The verse says that everyone went on this procession for Jacob, but they left behind their children, and they left behind their sheep, and they left behind their cattle. That they all left in the land of Goshen in Egypt, and everyone else went. Why did the Torah tell me that? I mean, imagine that the Torah had not gone out of its way to tell you whether or not the people joining Jacob's funeral procession had brought their little kids along with them. Let's say we'd not been told whether the sheep and cattle had come along. Would you have read the story of Jacob's burial and then, closed your copy of the Chumash in astonishment, slapped your knee and exclaimed, "But I wonder what happened with all those little kids? Did they take them all along? Did they leave them with babysitters? What were the daycare arrangements like? And all those animals? Was someone cattle sitting?" You probably wouldn't have said that, right? Why then does the Bible bother to tell us about these details? Of what significance is this completely trivial information? But consider this. In that phrase about the little kids and the cattle, we actually hear a premonition of things to come. Because when else in the Bible are there Israelites getting ready to leave Egypt? And then suddenly the issue of whether they bring along their little kids, their sheep, and their cattle starts to take center stage. That happens during the story of the Exodus. As you may recall from your previous knowledge of the Exodus, child care and animal care logistics actually were part of the negotiations between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses had originally asked Pharaoh not for a blanket release of all the Israelites to leave for good and make a new home for themselves in the Promised Land. On the contrary, Moses' original request of Pharaoh was much more limited. Could you please let your slaves go for just 3 days into the desert to worship their God, the creator that they worship? Pharaoh, of course, at first arrogantly denies that request, and later on he gives in to it partially. He asks for the children and perhaps the cattle to be left behind. Look at that. The children and the animals, they become an issue. Interesting. But it could be a coincidence, but let's keep on going and see. Are there other parallels between the Exodus story and the burial of Jacob? Turns out there are. Consider the location at which the burial procession stopped for a while to eulogize Jacob before they got to their ultimate destination in the caves of Machpelah. This was called Goren Ha'atad. The Torah actually makes a point of telling us exactly where Goren Ha'atad was located. Vayavo ad Goren Ha'atad asher be'ever hayarden. They came to Goren Ha'atad, which is on the other side of the Jordan River. But let's just do a little reality check of the geography. What exactly was the burial procession doing on the east bank of the Jordan? The shortest route from Egypt to Hebron is actually basically to just head northwest in a straight line. If the burial party traveled to Canaan via Goren Ha'atad, it means they went seriously out of their way. Leaving Egypt, they'd had to swoop down to the south of Canaan, traverse the entire Sinai Desert, swing up and around the Dead Sea, travel due north for the entire length of the sea, hook left to cross the Jordan River, probably somewhere near Jericho, and that would really be taking the long way. The truth is, I can't explain to you why they chose such a roundabout route for the burial procession, but the fact that they did is very intriguing, because that particular route reminds the reader of another great journey, That was the route the children of Israel took centuries later in the event we know as the Exodus from Egypt. So the route of the burial party anticipates the route of the Exodus. Very intriguing. That's another connection between the burial story and the Exodus. But there's still one more connection I want to share with you. Let's talk about Canaanite onlookers. So in the burial story, the Torah makes a point of telling us that the Canaanites gazed out at the burial procession, which of course included lots of Egyptians along with the family of Jacob, and they exclaimed in wonder, "What heavy mourning this is for Egypt." Well, in the Exodus story, wouldn't you know it, the Canaanite onlookers are back again. This time they appear in the ecstatic song of thanksgiving that the Israelites sing after the victory of the Sea of Reeds. If you look at that song, there's a role that the Canaanite onlookers have. And it's actually the same role as these onlookers had in the burial story. Shamu amim yirgazun namogu kol yoshvei Canaan. The inhabitants of Canaan, they react with astonishment at what's happened to Egypt. Egypt was this huge army, but they were destroyed. And now they're shrinking away in fear. So one by one, each of these elements from the burial story, they all seem to get repeated in the Exodus story. The chariots and the archers, the babysitting and the animal care arrangements, the route taken by Egypt to Israel, even the Canaanite onlookers. It seems as if these connections between the burial story and the Exodus stories are more than the product of mere coincidence. The Torah seems to be asking you and me, the reader, to line up these two journeys away from Egypt and to actually see them in relationship to one another. So here's the theory I'd like to suggest to you. I want to suggest that the Jacob's burial story is a kind of precursor to the Exodus story. And more than that the Torah actually sets up this burial story almost as a kind of lens through which you and I can look out upon the Exodus. If we look through that lens, we'll actually find ourselves looking at something remarkable, a whole new way of seeing the Exodus as a whole. That new perspective on the Exodus, it'll help us answer the question we raised above about taking honor from killing people, what exactly that meant. But it's also, again, going to help us see really the whole story of the Exodus differently. It'll help us see our destiny differently because we are the nation that came into being through this story of the Exodus. But in order to see how that's so, we need to go back and examine the Jacob's burial story, that lens, just a little bit more carefully. Let's do that in the next video. Come with me, I'll see you there.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to watch more amazing Torah videos by Aleph Beta.